The Drather had always prided themselves on their cold, calculating logic. For centuries, their empire had expanded through conquest, using superior technology and ruthless efficiency to crush any species that dared to resist them. They viewed themselves as the ultimate strategists, and when they encountered humanity, they saw little to fear. Humans were primitive in their eyes, emotional, chaotic, and irrational. Sure, they had shown a surprising resilience in their battles thus far, but that was only because the Drather had yet to deploy their true strategies. This time, however, the Drather Council had devised a new approach. After several skirmishes that had not gone as planned, a decision was made to exploit the most obvious weakness they saw in humans: their emotional bonds, particularly with their young. The Council believed that by capturing human children, they could leverage those bonds to force the humans to surrender. It was a calculated move, one designed to exploit what the Drather viewed as a flaw in human nature. The Drather military high command approved the operation. In their minds, capturing children would demoralize humanity and push their leaders to the negotiating table. A peaceful surrender would be far more efficient than continuing a costly war, and what better way to ensure compliance than to take humanity's future hostage? A raid was launched on a human colony located in a distant sector of space. The Drather ships descended swiftly, bypassing the colony's meager defenses with ease. Within hours, they had taken dozens of children, leaving the colony in chaos. The Drather commander overseeing the operation reported back with satisfaction. "The humans are disorganized, as expected. The children have been secured and will be transported to our holding facility aboard the flagship." Back on the Drather homeworld, the Council congratulated themselves on what they believed was a masterstroke. The captured children would be held until humanity's leaders agreed to the Drather's demands. It seemed like a simple plan, one that would guarantee victory with minimal bloodshed. But not all within the Drather ranks were convinced. Commander Eskiel, an officer who had studied human behavior more closely than most, was uneasy. He had seen reports of human adaptability and resilience, traits that didn't align with the Drather's understanding of their enemy. Eskiel had reviewed countless human psychological profiles, and while the Drather Council believed humans to be predictable and emotional, Eskiel had a different view. "These humans, they don't think the way we do," he warned during a briefing. "We assume they will surrender because of the children, but what if they don't? What if we've misjudged their response?" His concerns were brushed aside. The Drather High Command was confident in their analysis. Humans were too attached to their offspring. They would never risk the lives of their children, and thus, they would have no choice but to negotiate. The military leadership dismissed Eskiel's warnings as paranoia, a typical reaction from an officer who spent too much time studying rather than acting. Meanwhile, aboard the Drather flagship, the children had been placed in a secure holding area. The Drather treated them as little more than livestock, providing basic necessities but little else. The Drather guards barely paid attention to their captives, convinced that the children posed no threat. After all, they were just children. What could they possibly do? The Drather believed they had complete control of the situation. The children had been taken without incident, and there was no sign of any resistance. The Drather soldiers stationed aboard the ship joked among themselves, referring to their new prisoners as harmless creatures. To the Drather, human children were weak and incapable, barely worth the resources spent on holding them. Eskiel, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had seen the defiance in human soldiers, the way they fought even when outnumbered and outgunned. He had read about their history, how they had survived on a harsh and dangerous planet, evolving through countless wars and conflicts. The humans were a species forged in struggle, and Eskiel couldn't help but wonder if that resilience extended to their young. Still, his concerns remained unheard. The Drather Council was focused solely on the broader strategy. The children were a bargaining chip, nothing more. The humans would fold, as any logical species would. There was no need to consider alternative outcomes. But even as the Drather settled into a false sense of security, the children aboard the ship were beginning to understand their situation. While the Drather believed they were dealing with frightened, helpless prisoners, they had made a critical error in judgment. These were not children who would sit idly by, waiting to be rescued. These were human children, resourceful, determined, and above all, resilient. The leader of the group, Sarah, quickly took stock of their situation. At 14 years old, she had already learned how to think under pressure. She had been raised on a frontier world, where survival often depended on quick thinking and adaptability. The Drather had taken her and the others from their homes, but Sarah wasn't about to let that break her. As the days passed, Sarah began organizing the group. The Drather's negligence had left them with several opportunities to gather information, and Sarah intended to take advantage of every one of them. Ethan, an 11-year-old with a knack for technology, became her right hand. He had managed to hide a handheld device when they were captured, a device the Drather had dismissed as a toy. Ethan wasn't playing games, though. He was hacking into the ship's low-level systems, gathering data on their surroundings. What he found surprised him. The Drather had made several key mistakes. Their security, while formidable against adult prisoners, was lax when it came to children. They hadn't anticipated any organized resistance. They hadn't even locked down critical systems, assuming that children were incapable of understanding their technology. Sarah and the others began to plan. They knew they had to be careful. The Drather weren't paying much attention to them, but that could change if they detected anything suspicious. So the children worked in secret, communicating through subtle gestures and whispers, ensuring that the Drather guards remained oblivious. The first step was understanding the ship's layout. Ethan managed to access the schematics, mapping out the routes they would need to take if they wanted to escape. The children memorized the details, rehearsing their plan mentally, preparing for the moment when they would make their move. Sarah remained cautious. She knew they couldn't rush into action. The Drather had underestimated them, but they were still dangerous. Timing was everything. They had to wait for the perfect opportunity, one where the Drather were distracted, overconfident in their belief that their prisoners were powerless. As the days went on, Sarah could see that the Drather were growing complacent. Their guards became less attentive, and the soldiers aboard the ship talked openly about their upcoming victory over humanity. The Drather were convinced that their plan was working, that the humans would soon surrender in exchange for their children. But Sarah knew something the Drather didn't. She knew that humans, even children, had a way of surprising their enemies when they least expected it. Sarah had been observing everything, the routines, the guards, the way the Drather moved through their ship with casual indifference. The aliens were so certain that the children were no threat, they barely checked the holding area except for regular meal drops. That arrogance was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. The Drather didn't see them as prisoners, just nuisances. But Sarah and the other kids were not going to stay trapped. They were preparing for their chance to fight back. The first step was simple: gather intel. Ethan had already been busy. His small device was more than a toy. It was a handheld tool with enough computing power to hack into the ship's basic systems. The Drather, assuming that human children wouldn't understand their technology, hadn't encrypted low-level access to the internal schematics. Ethan tapped into those systems, learning everything he could about the ship's layout, its weak points, and where the guards stationed themselves. "What do you see?" Sarah asked as Ethan stared intently at the glowing screen. "There's a ventilation shaft behind one of the walls," he whispered. "I think it leads to the lower deck. If we can get through there, we'll be out of this block." The plan was forming. Sarah gathered the rest of the group, and together they worked out the details. The Drather weren't paying close attention, so the children knew they had to use that to their advantage. First, they had to distract the guards. Then they'd make their way through the vents and reach the docking bay. Once there, they'd figure out how to get off the ship. They didn't have the luxury of overthinking it. They just had to act. Sarah kept her team focused. Each child had a role to play. She assigned a couple of the younger kids to create a distraction by acting like they were fighting, something that would draw the guards' attention. Meanwhile, she, Ethan, and a few others would slip through the ventilation system. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the best shot they had. The first attempt came the next day. As planned, two younger kids started a loud argument in the holding area, pushing and shoving each other, creating enough of a commotion that one of the Drather guards stepped in to restore order. The guard, assuming it was just typical childish behavior, moved in closer, shouting at the kids to quiet down. Sarah and Ethan took that moment to slip unnoticed toward the vent panel. Within seconds, Ethan had pried it open and climbed inside, Sarah following close behind. The ventilation shaft was narrow, but it led them exactly where they needed to go. Moving as quickly and quietly as possible, they crawled through the ducts, stopping occasionally to listen for any nearby guards. Fortunately, the Drathers' overconfidence worked in their favor. There were fewer patrols in these areas, and most of the guards were stationed near more critical sections of the ship. As they moved, Sarah whispered to Ethan, "How much further to the docking bay?" "2 more turns, I think," Ethan replied, glancing at his device. "We should be there soon." They pressed on, every movement deliberate, every sound muted. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the exit vent that led to the corridor near the docking bay. Sarah carefully peeked through the slats, checking for any sign of the Drather. "It's clear," she said quietly. "Let's go." One by one, the children slipped out of the vent and into the corridor. The air in the ship was cold, the lights dim, but their senses were sharp, their minds racing. They weren't safe yet, but they were out of their prison. Now came the real challenge, getting to the docking bay without being caught. They moved quickly but cautiously, hugging the walls and staying in the shadows. Ethan had already disabled the security cameras in this section, but they knew they couldn't afford to linger. The Drather could realize they were missing at any moment. When they reached the entrance to the docking bay, they paused, listening for any signs of activity. Through the doors, they could hear the hum of machinery and the low murmur of alien voices. The Drather were nearby, but they didn't seem to be alert. "Okay," Sarah whispered. "We stick to the plan. We need to get a ship powered up, but we can't let them notice. Ethan, can you handle the ship's systems?" Ethan nodded confidently. "Yeah, I think I can. If we can get inside, I'll figure out how to launch it." The group took a deep breath, knowing that this was the most dangerous part of the plan. Sarah signaled to the others, and they quietly made their way into the docking bay, sticking to the shadows. A few Drather technicians were working on the other side of the room, but they were distracted, absorbed in their tasks. They spotted a small transport ship in the corner of the bay, its hatch unlocked. It wasn't heavily guarded. Again, the Drather didn't expect anyone to be foolish enough to try to steal one of their ships, let alone a group of human children. Ethan slipped into the cockpit, his fingers flying over the controls as he worked to activate the ship's systems. Sarah and the others stood guard, watching for any sign that the Drather had noticed them. "Almost there," Ethan muttered, his hands shaking with both excitement and fear. The ship's lights flickered on, and a low hum filled the cabin as the engines powered up. Sarah's heart raced. "How long until we're ready to launch?" "Just a few more seconds," Ethan replied, adjusting the controls. "Keep an eye on those guards." Suddenly, one of the Drather technicians glanced in their direction, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Sarah's stomach dropped. They had been spotted. Without hesitation, Sarah shouted, "Go! Start the launch sequence!" Ethan slammed his hand down on the console, and the transport ship's engines roared to life. The Drather technician yelled something in his alien language, and alarms began to blare throughout the docking bay. "Get in, everyone!" Sarah commanded, and the rest of the children scrambled aboard the ship just as the Drather guards began rushing toward them. The docking bay doors slid open, and the transport ship lifted off the ground, its thrusters blasting as it shot out into space. The Drather were left behind, scrambling to figure out what had just happened. The children were free, but they weren't safe yet. Alarms were still ringing, and the Drather would undoubtedly pursue them. Sarah turned to Ethan, who was piloting the ship with determination etched on his face. "Where to now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension. "We need to get far enough away to send a distress signal," Ethan said, scanning the ship's navigational systems. "If we can get a human ship to intercept us, we'll be fine." Sarah nodded. The escape had been a success, But the real challenge was surviving long enough for someone to find them. The transport ship rocketed through space, the hum of its engine steady as the children tried to catch their breath. They had done it. They had escaped the Draa ship. But Sarah knew this was only the beginning. The Draa would be coming after them, and they had little time before the pursuit began. Ethan worked quickly at the ship's controls, setting a course to put as much distance between them and the Draa vessel as possible. His hands moved with precision, despite the gravity of the situation. "We've got a head start," he said, keeping his voice calm. "But they'll be on us soon." Sarah glanced at the others. They had all worked together, but now they were relying on Ethan's expertise to keep them alive. "Can we send out a distress signal?" she asked. Ethan nodded, still focused on the controls. "I'm working on it. The ship's comm system is encrypted, but I think I can bypass it and send out a beacon." Sarah clenched her fists. Every second mattered now. If they could reach the human fleet, they had a chance. But if the Draa caught up before then, their escape would be over before it even began. Meanwhile, back on the Draa ship, alarms blared as the commander of the vessel struggled to make sense of the situation. It was unthinkable that a group of human children had managed to steal one of their ships and escape. His arrogance, the very thing that had blinded him to the capabilities of the children, was now his downfall. "They're just children!" the commander shouted, fury lacing his words as his officers scrambled to recover. "How could this have happened?" Commander Ezekiel, the one Draa officer who had warned about underestimating the humans, stood silently at the back of the room. His expression was grim. He had seen this coming. The humans were far more resilient than the Draa had ever realized, and that resilience extended even to their youngest. Ezekiel had tried to warn the others, but no one had listened. Now the consequences of their hubris were playing out in real time. "Dispatch the pursuit ships," the Draa commander ordered. "We can't let them escape. Bring them back, dead or alive." Ezekiel finally spoke up. "With all due respect, Commander, if they've managed to steal one of our ships and evade capture, it's unlikely they'll be easy to recover. Humans, even their children, are more resourceful than we thought." The commander shot him a glare, but Ezekiel's words were already sinking in. Still, the commander refused to back down. He wouldn't admit defeat so easily. "Send out the ships. We'll crush them before they can reach the human fleet." As the Draa ships launched in pursuit, Sarah and her group kept pushing forward. Ethan had managed to send out a distress signal, but there was no guarantee it would be received in time. The kids were tense, knowing they were racing against the clock. "We've got incoming," Ethan suddenly said, his voice tight with urgency. "The Draa have launched pursuit ships. They'll catch up to us in minutes." Sarah's mind raced. They had come so far, and she wasn't about to let the Draa drag them back. "Is there anything we can do to hold them off?" Ethan's fingers flew across the console as he scanned the ship's systems. "This isn't a combat vessel. It's a transport ship, minimal defenses. We've got some maneuverability, but if they catch us, we're in trouble." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Then we make sure they don't catch us. Do whatever you can to keep us ahead of them." The ship lurched as Ethan engaged evasive maneuvers, weaving through asteroid fields and taking unpredictable turns to throw off their pursuers. The other kids held on tight, their faces pale but determined. They had escaped once, and they weren't about to give up now. Ethan pushed the ship to its limits, but the Draa were relentless. The pursuit ships closed in, their weapons systems locking onto the stolen transport. Alarms blared as the first few shots grazed their hull, shaking the ship violently. "We're not going to last much longer like this," Ethan shouted over the noise. Sarah looked around, her mind racing. They couldn't outrun the Draa forever. They needed to buy more time. "Is there anything we can do to slow them down?" Ethan hesitated for a second before responding. "There's one thing. I could reroute power from the engines to boost our shields temporarily. It won't last long, but it might hold them off for a bit." "Do it," Sarah said without hesitation. Ethan quickly adjusted the settings, diverting power to the shields. The transport ship's engine sputtered slightly, but the shields flared to life, absorbing the next volley of shots from the Drather ships. It worked, but only for a moment. The shield wouldn't hold forever, and they all knew it. "How much longer until we're in range of the human fleet?" Sarah asked, gripping the back of Ethan's seat. Ethan checked the navigation system. "A few more minutes, maybe less if we can hold out." The tension in the ship was thick. Every second felt like an eternity as the Drather continued to close in. The pursuit ships had gained too much ground, and the shields were beginning to fail. "Shields are at 30%, Ethan said grimly. "We're almost out of time." Sarah looked at the other kids, seeing the fear in their eyes. But beneath that fear, there was determination. They had made it this far together, and they weren't going to let the Drather win. Not now. Just as the shields were about to collapse, a new signal appeared on the ship's radar. "Wait," Ethan said, his voice suddenly filled with hope. "I'm picking up human ships, multiple contacts. They're coming right at us." A surge of relief washed over them. The human fleet had received their distress signal, and they were closing in fast. The Drather ships, realizing they were about to be outnumbered, immediately began to back off. "They're retreating," Ethan announced, a grin spreading across his face. The kids cheered as the human ships arrived, forming a protective screen around the transport. The Drather pursuit ships had no choice but to turn tail and flee, their commanders unwilling to risk a direct confrontation with the human fleet. As the adrenaline began to wear off, Sarah slumped into a seat, her heart pounding. They had made it. They had escaped, and they had survived. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the knowledge of what they had just accomplished. The human fleet hailed the transport, and Sarah took a deep breath before responding. They had a story to tell, one that the Drather wouldn't forget anytime soon. Back aboard the Drather ship, Commander Eskiel watched the screen as the human fleet rescued the children. The pursuit had failed, just as he had predicted. The Drather's arrogance had cost them dearly. He turned to the commander, whose face was now pale with the realization of what had happened. "You underestimated them," Eskiel said quietly. "Even their children are a force to be reckoned with." The commander said nothing, his eyes fixed on the screen as the human fleet disappeared into the distance, taking the children with them. Eskiel knew one thing for certain: the Drather had made a grave mistake. The human fleet moved swiftly, bringing the stolen transport into their protective formation. Relief washed over the children as they realized they were safe, at least for the moment. Sarah sat back, her body still tense from the adrenaline rush. They had made it. The Drather pursuit ships had turned back, unwilling to engage the human fleet. For now, the danger had passed. As the children waited for contact from the human ships, the weight of what they had just accomplished began to sink in. They had escaped from an enemy warship, outmaneuvered an alien species that had believed them to be harmless, and now they were about to be rescued. It was more than any of them could have imagined just a few days ago. Sarah looked around at the others, seeing the same mix of exhaustion and pride on their faces. They had worked together, fought together, and survived. Even Ethan, who was usually calm and focused, seemed on the verge of disbelief. "I can't believe we actually did it," he said quietly, shaking his head. Before Sarah could respond, a voice crackled through the comm system. "This is Captain Morell of the UHS Resolute. We've received your distress signal. You're safe now. Prepare for docking." Sarah took a deep breath and leaned forward to reply. "Thank you, Captain. We're ready." The docking process was quick, and soon the children were aboard the human ship. As they stepped out of the transport, they were met with a mixture of shock and admiration from the crew. These were the children who had defied the Drather, the ones who had stolen an enemy ship and made it back alive. Their story was already beginning to spread, and the crew couldn't help but look at them with awe. Captain Morell approached Sarah, his expression a mix of disbelief and respect. "You kids really did all that?" he asked, his voice filled with amazement. Sarah nodded, still catching her breath. "We didn't have a choice." The captain smiled, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned. You saved yourselves and gave us valuable intel in the process. The Drather won't forget this, but neither will we. As the children were debriefed and given medical evaluations, the full scope of what they had accomplished began to take shape. Their escape hadn't just been a desperate attempt to survive, it had dealt a serious blow to the Drather's pride. The Drather had underestimated them, believing that human children would be easy to control, a simple pawn in their broader game. But that arrogance had backfired spectacularly. Word of the escape reached human high command quickly. The children were hailed as heroes, their actions praised not just for their bravery but for the strategic impact they had on the war. By escaping, they had not only saved themselves, but they had exposed critical weaknesses in the Drather's mindset. The Drather had shown their hand, revealing their belief that humans were weak, that children were nothing more than leverage. Now, humanity had something to use against them. The children, especially Sarah and Ethan, were briefed on the broader implications of their escape. They learned that their actions had disrupted the Drather's plans. The capture of human children was meant to demoralize the population and force human leaders into making concessions. Instead, the Drather were now facing public outrage and an energized military ready to strike back. Captain Morrell pulled Sarah aside after the debriefing. His expression was serious, but there was a warmth in his voice. You did something incredible out there. You showed the Drather that we won't break, no matter what they try. You gave us a chance to hit them where it hurts. Sarah nodded, but her mind was racing. The Drather weren't going to give up easily. If anything, this defeat would only make them more determined. But now, humanity had the upper hand. The Drather had revealed their weakness, not in their ships or their weapons, but in their mindset. They didn't understand humans, not really. They thought in terms of logic and control, never realizing that humanity's strength came from something deeper, the ability to adapt, to survive against impossible odds. As the children were escorted to their quarters, Sarah couldn't help but think about the Drather. She remembered the way they had treated them, like they were nothing, like they couldn't possibly be a threat. But even now, she knew the Drather still didn't fully understand. They didn't see humans as equals, and that was their biggest mistake. Meanwhile, aboard the Drather flagship, the mood was far from celebratory. The Drather commander stood in silence, staring at the empty space where the human fleet had vanished. His fists were clenched at his sides, his mind racing with the implications of what had just happened. He had lost them, children, no less. And now the entire Drather High Command would know of his failure. The tension in the command center was thick. Officers moved quietly, afraid to draw attention to themselves. They knew the repercussions of this failure would be severe. The Drather Empire did not tolerate weakness, and this debacle would be seen as nothing less than an embarrassment. Eskiel, standing near the back, watched the commander's reaction carefully. He had warned them. He had tried to make them see that humans were not the simple, predictable species they believed them to be. But no one had listened. Now they were facing the consequences. The commander turned slowly, his eyes filled with barely contained rage. We underestimated them, he growled, the words like venom in his mouth. We underestimated humans, children. Eskiel stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You underestimated their spirit. Humans are unpredictable, and that makes them dangerous. We assumed they would act like any other species, but humans are not driven by logic alone. We should have seen this coming. The commander's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He knew Eskiel was right. The Drather had misjudged humanity from the beginning, and now they were paying the price. They'll retaliate, Eskiel continued. They'll see this as a victory, and they'll use it to rally their people. We need to change our approach, or this war will become far more difficult than we anticipated. The commander nodded slowly, though his pride clearly stung. We will adjust. But this failure will not go unanswered. We will strike back, and when we do, the humans will understand that this was nothing more than a temporary victory. But deep down, Eskiel knew that the Drather's biggest problem wasn't the human fleet or their technology. It was their inability to truly understand their enemy. The humans had proven, even through their children, that they couldn't be controlled or predicted. And as long as the Drather continued to think of them as lesser beings, they would never win this war. Back on the human ship, Sarah sat quietly in her quarters, thinking about everything that had happened. They had escaped, but the war was far from over. She knew the Drather would come for them again, but now, they had something the Drather didn't, an understanding of their enemy's arrogance. Sarah smiled faintly to herself. They had survived, and they had shown the Drather that humans, no matter their age, were never to be underestimated.